like 50 of them, and I got to figure out which 5 you used. An extra one is not going to hurt anything. So what I want to do today is we're going to start talking about color correction. And it's not the easiest thing. It takes a bit to truly grasp it and understand it. Hence another reason why I want to record this, because then you can go back to these things. I actually have something I'm going to open as we talk about it. Because this is not in the book, that's the other downfall. It is not in the textbook. I put together an actual PowerPoint for this class, just to be able to. That's not what I wanted you to do. I want you to open from the binder. There we go. Just so I can discuss some of these things and then show you in Photoshop to make it a little bit easier. I have a couple of resources that I sourced in here too, with links that you can go back and look at those if you want. But also I reference this book called Skin. This is more for color correcting skin tones, which we will cover as part of our discussion, even though that's not all of it. But if you do a lot of portraits, or you're interested in just different things when it comes to lighting, post-production and stuff like that from a portrait standpoint, this book called Skin is awesome. There's a second edition of this book. I put the link in Blackboard for you guys for the second edition, but what I found was weird is that it links to Amazon, and they don't have the second edition for purchase through Amazon. You have to buy it through other sellers, but the first one is still available. That's weird. And this one's way older than the other one. The other one has a copyright of 2010, which I thought was old. I was looking for a third edition and I couldn't find it. But the concepts are the same regardless. It's just the screenshots that are outdated is the only thing. But everything else is really great material. But I think that this has one of the best references when it comes to skin color correction, as far as looking at numbers and stuff like that and what you have to do with it. But we're going to talk about variations of just tone color correcting for different things, and then also try and touch on the skin. The skin is the harder one, but it'll cover, even though we'll localize it to a skin color correction, it'll cross over to all different areas. So I just want to have these conversations. This is something we can work on more than just today, because it is going to take some time. But my goal today is really just to have you guys understand using the eyedroppers, whether it's in curves or levels, the difference in what curves and levels is going to do, and then how we can manipulate that as we work with color. Yeah, Angela.
Can we talk about other skin tones? Because I was trying to do a photo of a young girl with an African-American skin tone, and you could see like where I removed her acne, and I wasn't sure like how to kind of blend it.
Blend that back in?
Yeah.
Yes. No, I have, actually that's in here with the numbers to refer back to, and it actually came from this book too. So, okay. Yes, nope, I have Caucasian skin, African-American skin, and then Asian skin as a reference for color correcting. So yes, we will talk about all of those things. So what we want to do is work on an image. Doesn't matter if it has a person in it or not, to get it from its original state to a state where the skin tones are much more vibrant or much more accurate to the actual skin tones of the person, especially when it comes to printing, because that's a whole nother aspect. When you print a photo, the contents always look a little bit different, so this gets us closer to that point. So the one thing to know, and this is the hard part when we talk about any color correction of any image, is that we all see color differently. I might see red a little bit differently than you do. I had a big argument with my dad over the color of a shirt, on whether it was magenta or purple. And I said, it is magenta. And he was adamant that it was not. So I actually brought it into Photoshop, took a screenshot of the RGB values and said, magenta. Look at the values. Like, I had to win this because he has to win everything. I had to win that one. So I took a screenshot and sent it to him. I said, this is magenta, end of conversation. So the other thing too, which is really interesting, is that the way we color correct here versus if we send an image to China or any type of Asian culture, they color correct differently than we do. So that's the other hard thing when it comes to color correction, is the the value of color is different in every culture. Blues are different in a culture. In an Asian culture, blues are valued higher than here, where we tend to do things warmer.
I think one of the things that was funny when I went to China, that you know how we have apps for selfies and things like that?
Yes.
They actually have an app for their selfies that will make their skin look paler, because
Really?
they really like pale skin.
Pale skin.
And so they have an app that will make their skin look paler. So they put everything through the app first before they post it on their social media.
That's interesting. Holy cow.
So that's how I related that to.
That's exactly what it is, because the lighter skin, the bluer the skin tones are, that is viewed as a better result than what we typically do. We tend to add yellow and magenta to everything. So it's really, yeah, unless you're Kristen, she does not like that at all. And it's funny because he actually talks about that in here too, and I can't remember where it is in this book, but he talked about how he sent an image that was supposed to be, I believe, in a magazine, if I'm remembering correct. It's been a long time since I read that part in this book. But he talks about, dang it, the other class, it's in this book. It wasn't a website link. There's my bitmap image. Dang it. I was talking about it in the last class. I'm like, I just saw it. It's in this flipping book. It was on a website because I was on Amazon scrolling through the pages that Amazon would let me in the book.
And have you seen that, that post on Facebook or whatever, that this person sends their picture to be photoshopped by all over the world?
All different, yeah, and the differentiations and how they like liquefied and stuff like that, and how they changed the body image based on that.
The wrong country.
Yeah, exactly. So it is interesting, but everyone color corrects a little bit differently in different cultures, so we have to realize that too. I had a student who was Hmong and would bring in images, and I would say, well, why your white balance is off? He's like, no, it's not. I changed it to that. Like, my white balance was correct, but then it looked blue. And then he explained the Hmong culture and blue and the color tones and stuff like that. I'm like, whoa, it's just, my mind exploded. I'm like, oh, I didn't fully understand the reasoning for that, but that was exactly why. And that's what he did in this book too. He sent it across, I think he said it was China, and then it came back completely blue, and he's like, that is not the file I sent you. And they're like, well, we had to fix it. And it turns out that's why. So the other thing we have to understand is that our monitors are going to display colors differently unless we do calibrate our monitors. These monitors aren't calibrated, which is the other reasoning why I think this is a great resource, because he talks about the RGB values and the CMYK values and how we have to color correct that way. Just because if our monitor is not calibrated, I mean, if you work on a laptop, if I sit 2 inches higher 10 minutes from now than I did when I started, the color is going to appear differently. When you look at these TV screens, it's this one to me from my angle is bright, that one is gray and toned down, and it's just because the angle I'm standing at compared to the monitor. So every time you sit, you move, you slouch, it changes how you see the color. So that's another issue that we have, and that's why we're going to talk about those values as much as we can. And then your work environment. You don't want to be somewhere where the walls are extreme colors, because that reflection on your monitor is going to actually change how you view the color on your monitor and how you color correct. So you have to consider all of these things. This is why when people color correct or work in a print lab, the walls are gray.
It's so depressing.
It is. It's so incredibly depressing. But that's the only way that you don't have influence of a color on your monitor when you're editing. So that's why I was glad our room turned out gray. And I didn't ask for it. I was so happy about it. Well, one of the conversations we have when it comes to color correcting is, do I use levels or curves? Now, you are probably more comfortable with one over the other. So you're like, oh, well, I always use levels. And to an extent, we can do everything in levels, but there might be some things in curves that are going to give us a little bit different of a result. So we just have to understand the main difference between the two of them. So I put a few points here, and this links out to a website too. If you want to view the whole article on it, I just pulled a few bullet points from it. So we definitely want to use levels when we're trying to set the black and white endpoints. You know, when your histogram doesn't cover the full spectrum from black to white, levels is great to adjust and bring in the histogram to have a definite black point and a definite white point. We can do it in curves too. It's just quick and easy in levels. If you want to do a basic tonal adjustment, light and dark, Levels is great for that because we drag that mid-tone slider, light or dark. And then if you're looking at, and it says you want to maintain the visual relationship of the values of the intermediate tones. That is confusing. But basically it's going to be the values of your RGB channels and the values of those midtones to the highlight and the shadow. And it's just it's a very linear adjustment is what it is. And that's kind of what it's talking about here. Whereas curves is a little bit different. Curves allows us to do a little bit more subtle adjustments between that. So we can lighten the darks and the shadows, but we can do it where maybe we just want to lighten the shadows but not the rest of the image. And we can tell our curve to do just that part of it and make that a gradual change by the way that curve flows versus that linear adjustment that a levels does where it's just lighter, darker, red, cyan. You know, when we make those adjustments, it's pretty obvious, a little bit quicker, where this is gradually. If you want to adjust just certain things, which I kind of talked about already, and then if you want to do just a small section of it, and when we start getting into our color correcting, that'll make a little bit more sense because we're going to use curves more than anything else. And I'm hoping you'll see the power of what it can do because we can be very particular about one part of an image and how that adjustment works versus it being more of a global type of a thing. So one thing we need to know is that no matter what we're using, it doesn't matter if it's levels or curves, we have to understand these eyedroppers. And those eyedroppers have 3 points that we can play with. So I'm going to briefly open an image here and just kind of play with it a little bit. I'm going to show you how to do exactly what this next spot says. So I'm going to come back to this. I'm going to open Photoshop. I need to get an image. I think I'm going to use Bridge because it's easier. Cancel. Let's try. I want an image that's kind of got some gray tones in it. That's kind of flat. Let's try. Let's see what this one does. Yeah, this one should work well. So let me just open this into Photoshop real quick. I'm not going to correct anything on this in RAW. I'm just going to open it in Photoshop. I could do these similar adjustments in Camera Raw, but I think you have to understand it in Photoshop first before you get to that point. So I'm going to start here. So I'm going to start, and I'm going to do everything as an adjustment layer because I highly recommend that. It makes it more non-destructive, easier to go back and change things later on versus going under the image menu and doing adjustments. I'm hoping you forget that that's there. That's my goal.
I have.
Good, because I don't want you to use that. I think it's better to have it all as separate layers. So I'm just going to do this in curves to show you, but it's the same in levels no matter what you decide to use here. So I'm just going to add a curves layer, and I have 3 eyedroppers here. And what this is basically going to do is allow me to choose what my shadow point is, what my highlight point is, and I can also choose that mid-tone gray point. And it's essentially an automatic adjustment. It's going to automatically adjust all the other, like the RGB channels individually in order to set all of these points. It's kind of like a white balance tool with more control and in addition to the highlight and the shadow. So whether or not you use, there's argument whether you should set the black point first or the white point. Oops, not what I wanted here. But I think that you should, oops, I skipped ahead here. I honestly think you should set the black point first and then the white point. But honestly, they're pretty much interchangeable as far as what you can do. I find if my white balance is way off and I'm trying to set my white and black point, I have a better result if I set the black point first and then the white point than the other way around. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this eyedropper and I'm going to try and find the darkest point. I just click the shadow eyedropper and now I have to find the darkest point, which can be hard to find in certain images and you just don't know what that is. So one thing you can do And this is true in Camera Raw, if you remember. If you hold down the Alt or the Option key and you drag your sliders, it turns it either completely white, completely black, and it shows you those values. If I, come on.
What do I have to press?
You hold down the Alt or the Option key. Option on a Mac, Alt on a PC. And it will change it to be completely white, but I can see, and it's hard to see in this particular image, if I zoom in here a little bit. When I do that, I can see right here, this is probably the darkest part of the image in these shadow areas here. So I can choose that point, and that's what I would click on right there. And it's going to adjust everything based on that. So it's going to say, I want that to be the darkest spot in the image. And I probably should have my...
So what if yours is completely white and there is like no?
There is none. That's going to be the tricky part. So one thing you can do to start is if you take, and let me undo this, if you take either in curves or level this slider to drag it to the point, and this image may not be the best example on the shadow side, drag it to the point where your histogram starts. That's usually one quick tonal adjustment that we talk about, where you just drag that white point to where you first have detail in your image, on the highlight and the shadow side. And that's going to adjust your histogram that now you should have a black point. You should be able to find a black point after you make that adjustment, that if you hold your shadow and you find that point and then you click on it, it should do that for you. But a lot of times we have to get the histogram in a place where we can do that first. The other thing you can do is to truly find that you've got that point when you're dragging those two sliders in. If you hold down the Alt option as you click and drag, you will see it shows you where those highlight and shadows start to actually come to life, I should say. So Alt option will be a good friend of yours when you're doing something like this. Then we would do the same thing for the highlight. We would click the highlight eyedropper, and we can hold down the Option key to see where that is. Now this image is a good example of where we don't really have that. So I'm going to click and drag my highlight slider until I have some detail. And you can see it's the red channel where I have an actual highlight. And then I'm going to simply, oops, I scrolled. Dang it. I put 2 fingers on it and I zoomed out. There we go. And I'm going to find a spot and I'm going to click that. If you have a spot where it's really blown out in the highlights, you don't want to use that as your white point. You could try it, but you may not get the result that you want, because what happens is if you have no color information in it, the little bit of color information it can find, it's going to skew your highlight or your white balance point. So you might find, I've had it before where I've clicked on a sky that was kind of blown out and it was a little too blown out, and the only color it could find was a magenta, and it gave it my entire image a magenta wash to it.
Blue.
Did it turn it blue? Yep, that happens too. So that could be it. So what you're going to see happen now is when I look at my curve, I'm in curves. If you're in levels, you'll see it a little bit differently. But when I look at it, it's showing me the white is going to be my overall luminance, my RGB, but then it shows me the red, the green, and the blue and how it had to adjust it based on the spot that I clicked. So my image was not white balanced properly. It was quite yellow. So it had to add a whole lot of blue to compensate for the yellow. I mean, it was kind of a yellow tone to it, but I'm a lot closer to what that actual color is. I can also click the mid-tone if I want to. I usually don't have to do this mid-tone one because you have to find a gray area. Yeah, you have to find a gray mid area for it, and I find that to be kind of difficult. But a lot of times if I just get the highlight and the shadow, I can tweak the rest from there. I usually don't use that one, but some people do. It just is really hard to pinpoint a gray spot or a spot that should be gray. And then it adjusts your curve or levels on that.
It just looks so different. Like, am I doing this right?
It depends on what your point is.
Okay, so I used like here for the highlight because it had some areas there, and I used the like the folds in her
down in
skirt
there,
for
yeah.
her.
Yeah, that's good. I think what might skew it is probably the fact that it's taking the
Yeah.
skin tone colors.
But
If there's a
otherwise-
spot up in
On
here
the
that's
wall.
bright enough,
Yeah.
that might give you a more accurate result. It doesn't have a true white point though. What about over here? It's a little bit better.
No, it's really red.
It's a little, yeah, it's a little too magenta and red. So yeah, we might have to take some of that out then after the fact.
Okay,
But it's getting you a bit closer.
okay.
Anyone else having problems with that?
I like the blue better.
I know you like the cooler tones anyway. Yeah, it's kind of funny. As a culture, we like the warmer tones. But it depends on what you're doing too. The cooler tones treat an image, I mean, the end result, it looks differently and emotionally. Colors are attached to emotions too. So when you see certain colors in an image, it's going to change the story. So once we have that, we can then play with the image a little bit. Now, one thing, if you have a hard time finding that point, or you have multiple color points that you want to come back to later on, maybe to pinpoint through some sort of adjustment, there's something you might want to use and you might find beneficial, and it's called the threshold. So if you don't know where those white or black points are, the threshold might help you, because what we can do is we would use a color sample and we can save these essentially like pinpoints of where our white and our black is. So what we need to use is we need to use that color sample tool. It is hiding here in Photoshop. It's under our eyedropper, but it's the color sample. It has that little target point in it. If we select this, now what we can do is we can select multiple color points. This is great when we color correct colors, when we're finding our white and our black point. This is really good to be able to save that exact point to be able to come back to later, or as we color correct, I'll show you the other thing this does. Before I bring up the threshold, what I want you to open, if you don't have it open already, in Windows is the Info tab. You are going to live and breathe this tab when you color correct. Something we need to look at with this tab, I don't know how yours appears, but I believe by default it should look like this, where on the left side it has the RGB values, on the right side it has the CMYK values. If yours doesn't say that, let me know. We have to change how it's viewed, but it should by default bring that up. I don't need to worry about anything else at this point in that Info tab, but what you're going to find is down below here where it's talking about click a spot on the image for the color sample. As we do this, that's going to come into play and help us as we adjust our image a little bit. So I'm going to, now that I have the Info palette so that I can use it, I'm going to go back to adjustments, and I want to, and I can never remember what threshold is. Threshold is on the bottom row in the middle. It's like that zigzag one. I want to bring up threshold. Now it is going to change our image to completely black and white, and it's going to look like a 2-bit image basically is what it's looking at. Threshold has no purpose aside from identifying certain points like black and white points and mid-tone points. It's really the only point of threshold. Otherwise, it's kind of rendered useless unless you want this effect on your image. But what it does is it shows us, so everything in this image that appears white at this point, because right now it's sitting right at the middle. If you remember, we are working on a scale of 0 to 255, 128 being complete mid-tone, middle gray, whatever you want to think of it as. Anything that appears white is higher than middle gray. Anything that appears black is darker than middle gray. And wherever we slide it, anything that's white is higher than whatever number we have it set at, and whatever is black is anything that we have darker. So what we can do is we can use threshold to find our white and black points. I can drag this all the way over to the right and start there. And as I slowly start dragging to the right, or I said right, I meant left, drag it all the way to the left to the black point. And as we start dragging it to the right, it's slowly going to start showing us where the actual black point is in our image. So where you start to see black, that, if I turn this layer off, is right here in the lock again. So that's the darkest point of my image. Where my slider is sitting at 8, anything that's showing in black is darker than 8. Now I have an actual black point. Oops, I want to zoom this way. Oops, scrolling, it's scrolling too fast. There we go. So now I'm finding my black point. So I like to find the part where it's like the biggest cluster of darkness. And I can use that color sample eyedropper to click. And all I'm doing is, you can see in my info palette, I have a number 1, and it's locking those values now, because as I move my mouse, it's showing me what the color value is of that particular spot where my mouse is. But where it says number 1, it's this little, it's hard to see.
My number 1 says 0, 0, 0, 0, 0.
That means it's completely black.
Okay.
So that's good.
Okay.
So it's just saying, and it's hard to see here, but I have my little target with a number 1. That's the point that I'm looking at right now. And it tells me the color values of it. So now I can set my white point. I'm going to zoom back out here. I'm going to take this threshold all the way here to the right, and I'm going to start dragging. I mean, I have a white point here, so I don't really have to drag it. But if I see nothing, I can start dragging it until I actually see a bright point and decide which point I want to use as my highlight. So maybe I want to use this part of the bar here. I'm going to zoom in just a little bit to get the right point. Maybe I want to use this spot. I can just click right here. And it's putting it where the eyedropper is, not the little target, just so you know. Because if you click the wrong spot, you might get a completely different color
Not
than
the
what you want.
target?
Not that little target. The end of the eyedropper is where it's going to put that point. So if you're picking a very particular point, you want the end of the eyedropper, not the little target. That confuses people, because it can give you a drastically different result. So now that I have those 2 spots, I'm simply just going to turn off threshold. I could delete it, but I'm going to leave it there just in case I need to come back to it for something else. But otherwise, I really don't need it at all. So I have my 2 points. I have my 1 here. I have my 2 here. And what I could do, if this is an image where it's harder to find those points, now when I go into my curves, when I pick my shadow, I don't have to think and guess. I just simply click on that point. And now when I go into my highlight, I simply go to the 2 and I click. And now I have adjusted my image based on that white and black point.
I
So it's
can't find my
cleaned
other
up.
point.
That's the other thing that's hard. Sometimes, I don't know if you were to hold down your option key when you do it. I'm trying to think there's 2. There it is.
Jessica, how
Yeah.
did you get the threshold open?
It's in the adjustment panel, and it's this one in the middle on the bottom row. That will add it and immediately turn it black and white. Did it work? So this is great for finding white, black points. You can even use it to find midtones if you want, because when it's in the middle, whatever shows up in black, that's the hard thing. It's hard to find midpoints with the threshold, but you can use it if you kind of know the areas of your image and kind of turn it on and off and say, all right, well at this point, if I can get to it, when it's at 128 or that midpoint, and I can turn it on and off and go, all right, it's kind of this area right in here where it's kind of got a little white and kind of got a little black. It's the midtone's kind of in that area right there, right on the edge of that contrast. It's harder to use it for that, so I don't recommend it, but you can. But for white and black points, it's great. So now I can use my eyedroppers and click those 2 points. The other thing is as I adjust, and here is if I, what you're gonna see is that there's 2 sets of numbers here, and this tells us 2 different things. Bless you. The first number before the slash tells us the original number. So that's the original red, green, and blue value of that image when it started. The number on the right of the slash is the after. So after any adjustments are applied, that's what the new RGB value is. So as I turn, I gotta zoom out to do this. as I turn that layer on and off, you're going to see that second number change because it's flipping back and forth between the original and the current state. Whatever's visible is what it's going to tell you on the right-hand side. So we usually pay attention to the number on the right. Every once in a while we compare it to the number on the left, but for the most part you'll probably ignore it. So you are going to notice that, and even when I mouse over my image in the info palette, the same thing happens in the RGB and the CMYK up there. It shows me the original and the current state. Does that make sense so far? Hopefully. All right, that's how we use the threshold. Go back here. Okay, those are basic tonal adjustments. This is where we start adding things in because now we're going to start working with the color. So what we have to understand is the difference between additive and subtractive. Additive is what our camera uses when it replicates color. So it takes red, green, and blue values and it combines them and adds those color values together to get whatever that end result is for that particular pixel. So when we have skin tones, it's adding a certain number of red pixels, green and blue, to combine to whatever tone that skin is. When we print stuff, print is the exact opposite. When we print an image to hang up, we're printing in cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. And the CMY values are subtractive. So it actually uses like a percentage of that color is usually how we view it. It's a percentage of the cyan ink, the percentage of the yellow ink, and it has to actually take away ink. Like when you, here, let's talk about it this way. This is easier to understand if it's confusing you. When you have additive colors, when you add all the RGB values together at full value, you get completely black. So red, green, and blue all added together makes the more color, the darker it appears when our camera's taking it. Hi, Bailey. But, and it appears kind of backwards in Photoshop, which is why it's confusing. But when we talk about subtractive color and the percentages, the lesser the percentage, the less ink that it's using, so it's using more white, if that makes sense. So the less ink it's using, the more light white the image appears. So if you have a white background, it essentially lays down like no ink whatsoever because it's subtractive. It's taking away the color, if that makes sense. So if we just know that print is subtractive and our camera photographs additive when it comes to combining colors, that's all we need to know to be able to do the next steps. We do need to know our color wheel because when we're color correcting, let's say we have too much yellow in an image, we have to use the complementary color on the color wheel to take away yellow. So if I have too much yellow in my image, I have to add blue to take away the yellow. If I have too much red, I need to add cyan. And if I have too much magenta, I need green, and vice versa for each one of those. So we have to work with the complementary color on the wheel in order to correct a color that's either too much or too little. So in order to do that, now that we know this, now what we need to know is when we work in, it doesn't matter if it's curves or if it's levels, what we need to understand is that if we have too much red in an image, we need to add cyan. And in the curves, when we look at the curves, and I bring up the curves because that's what you'll use more often, hopefully, but this is true in levels too, it's just on a linear scale, that anything above in curves, that angled diagonal line is neutral. Think of it as that neutral point. That's your starting point. And however I bend and work that curve, anything that goes above that line in the red channel is red. Anything that goes below that line is cyan. So if I am taking this curve, let me go into my image here. If I take my curves palette and I go into my red channel, if I drag my curve up, I am adding red. If as I drag it down, I'm taking away red and I'm adding cyan. So the down direction adds cyan, the up direction adds red. Just depends on what you're trying to do to the image. in the green channel, up adds green, down adds magenta. And it's just opposite of the color wheel. So this is all it is. And in the blue channel, up adds blue, down adds yellow. So that's what we need to understand, is just what goes with what. Now the easiest way to remember that, because it takes a little bit to remember that, is your info palette. Whatever is straight across from that color, whatever straight across from red is the complement. Straight across from red is cyan, straight across from green is magenta, and straight across from blue is yellow. So if you just know to look what's right across from it on the info palette, you're fine. You don't have to think anymore because it's right there. And then black is K, and that's always separate, so we don't, that's a whole different conversation. We only need to worry about cyan, magenta, and yellow. It's very weird that our images stay in RGB. They photograph in RGB. We send them to print in RGB, but print prints them in CMYK. So that's because those are the inks that's used.
Okay.
Yeah. So printers use CMYK inks. So there are some instances, if you work with graphic designers, stuff like that, you may have to send an image in CMYK color mode to them for print. When we talk photographic printing, that's what's a little weird. Photographic printers use an RGB image even though it uses CMYK inks. I know that's strange and confusing, but that's just how those printers are built to work. But yeah, if you do work with designers, they will probably request that you send CMYK images, or they would convert your image to CMYK, which might shift the color a little bit. But a photo printer, we don't have to worry about that. So now that we know red, cyan, green, magenta, blue, yellow, we can start talking about and playing around with color values and working with the color in order to correct certain things on this image. So within any image that you have open, you can decide what parts of that image you want to correct. So I'm keeping my color sample open for this, because what I'm going to do is my number 1 and my number 2 are my black and my white points. I'm going to set more points just to use them as a reference as I adjust the color to see how it's changing the color of that part of the image. So I like to find a part that I know I need to correct. So like on this image, yes, the cells are actually kind of that color, but it's a little too magenta yet and a little too yellow. I want to cool that off. So I'm going to find a spot where those color values are apparent, where I know it's a little too yellow and magenta, and I'm going to try and correct that in curves. But I'm going to set that point, I'm going to let that be my number 3 point, so that I can see how the RGB values are being adjusted. And then maybe I want something in the shadowy area just to make sure as I'm adjusting the midtones and the highlights that it doesn't change too much in the shadow areas. But every image you do is going to be different. If you're doing a portrait, you might be taking a sample of a skin tone on the forehead and on the cheek, because cheeks tend to have more pink magenta-ish kind of colors to it, and you might want to watch that. So you might be taking those samples, or you might have a sample of the person's shirt. Maybe they're wearing a white shirt, but you're adjusting the skin tones, and you want to make sure that your white shirt stays white and doesn't turn pink. So you might you might put color sample points there to watch those points. If you're doing a landscape, you might want to have the foliage one as a color sample. You might want to have the flowers as another sample to make sure as you're changing the color of the flower that you're not going too far off from the green in the foliage. Obviously, layer masks are going to have to fix that, but we are watching that as we're color correcting overall. So I'm just going to set a couple of points here. And then I can use these points, I can use number 3 to say, okay, well, as I look at these RGB values, if, like for example, it's supposed to be gray, I know I have a problem here because my blue is at 82 and my red is at 57. So if that's supposed to be gray, there is way too much red and a little bit too much green in this image that I need to either increase the blue or bring down the other 2 color values to kind of make it more neutral. I can use this as a guide now and say, okay, well, let's say this is supposed to be gray. It's not, but just as an example to show you what it would do, I will. I'm going to go into, and this part just comes with time and practice. I know that if I increase the blue, I am going to be overall brightening that image. So I have to make the decision as I make this adjustment to neutralize it, do I want the image to get brighter or do I want the image to get darker? Because we know 0 is completely black and 255 is completely white. And I know this part will be confusing, but just to kind of at least bring it to your attention, whether or not you retain the information or not is another story. But right now, blue is sitting at 82, which means it's darker. There's less blue values, so the blue color channel is essentially closer to being like on the black end of it, whereas 157 for my red is closer to a highlight. It's closer to the brighter side of it. And if I bring blue value up to get closer to that, if I want to neutralize this, all these numbers should be almost the same. So I could increase blue to get closer to these red and green values. Overall, my image will get a little bit brighter. Or I could choose the red and green channel to bring down closer to 82. Overall, my image is going to get a little bit darker. Deepen those colors is what's going to happen. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to play with both just to show you what it does. But what I need to do now is, now I need to choose, I'm going to try and bring the blue and green up a little bit closer to the red, kind of meet somewhere in the middle. I'm going to go, I have to go into that particular color channel. So I'm going to start with blue. I'm going to go into blue. The more you start color correcting, the more you're going to want to know the quick keys to flip between those channels. And it's option 2, 3, 4, and 5. Just so you know, that takes a while to remember those quick keys. But option 2 gets you to the RGB. Option 3 gets you to red, 4 to green, 5 to the blue color channel. And that's true across any adjustment tool that you're using where you can go into the color channels. And it does say on there, but it takes a little bit to get used to. But trust me, I'll show you this when we get to the end. I'll just quickly open an image and I'm going to color correct it beginning to end without stopping, so you can see how fast you can actually go and how those quick keys will help quite a bit.
Can you repeat those again, Jessica?
Yes, option 2 is RGB. Option 3 is red. Option 4 is green. And option 5 is blue. And it is in the menu. When you click on it to drop it down, you'll see the numbers show there if you ever forget. So I'm going to start in the blue because for my particular image, it's going to be easier to start with the blue. And then I want to kind of meet somewhere, I want to meet in the middle. I'm going to use that green value as kind of my pinpoint if I'm trying to make this particular spot here. If that's supposed to be completely like a gray neutral color, even though the cells were not that color, we're going to pretend they are for the moment. And I'm going to try and meet somewhere in the middle. So I'm going to start with my blue channel, but here's what we need to know. This little thing here with the hand and the pointer and the up-down arrow, it's going to become a really good friend of yours when it comes to adjusting. Because what this allows us to do is I can activate this. It essentially is turning it into an eyedropper, but what you'll see is as I move the mouse around, I don't know how well you can see it, as I move the mouse around, my point on the curve changes. You'll see a little open circle on your curves. And it's just saying if I want to adjust this part of my image where my mouse is, that's where it falls on the curve. That's the point that I'm adjusting. That's all that means. The cool part about using that color sample tool and having these 4 points in place already is that I can now just go to my number 3, because that's what I'm adjusting, and I can click on it, and when I click, it puts that point on you'll see the square on my curve. Now I have a point that I can adjust up and down. I can click and drag, and it will move it up and down, So I can do it that way. So if I want to bring my blue, if I want to increase my blue closer to that green value, which is 130, if I click and drag up, I'm adding blue, which is increasing that number. If I drag down, my image is going to start to get more yellow because I'm going in the opposite direction. So I want to get it a bit closer. I'm not going to just drag it up to 130 because that's not going to work well. What you're going to find is that you have to toggle between all 3 color channels until you get there. You can't just say, I'm going to crank up the blue, then I'm going to go to the red, and I'm going to drag that down, and it's going to be done. Because what you're going to find, as I change one, it changes the other. So it's this constant little battle of getting there. So I'm just going to increase it quite a bit here to start with. But now I'm going to go to my red channel, and I'm going to do the same thing. So I'm going to go, and I'm going to use the quick key. I'm going to use option 3 to get to the red channel. And as long as I have this little modify curve hand icon activated, anywhere I click, it's going to put a point on my curve. So I can click on my 3 and start dragging it. I can click on my 4 and start dragging it. I can do whatever I want. It'll just keep putting points. So I'm going to click there and click and drag, but I'm going to bring it down, which is going to take out some of that red and bring that 157 starting point down closer to that 130. Again, it's going to look wrong on this image because this image is not supposed to be gray, but we're going to use it as a guide. So I can click and drain. I can click and drag. I'm going to show you something that's easier than clicking and dragging. Oh, yeah, there we go. So all you're going to do is you're going to start watching the color values and see what is that 4. So you're going to look at number 4, and as you drag up and down, you're going to try and get, you know, if you want that to be gray, which on her face it won't look right,
Yeah.
but if you want it to be gray, you're just going to grab, let's see, are you in the blue channel? If you want it to be a bit closer to the other ones, you're going to drag your blue up. And then that point, it will bring, you'll see number 4 should change a little bit as you're dragging it up and down. And you just want those numbers to be closer together.
Why?
If this is a gray point,
Okay.
neutral gray, all 3 color
Oh,
channels
yeah,
would read the
that's
same
right.
value. Yep, on her face it won't look
It's-
right,
Yeah.
but yeah. Anyone else having a problem with it?
Yeah, that's what was throwing me off. I thought like.
Someone else said.
I was doing that on her face, not on a neutral.
Oh, not on a neutral point? Yeah.
Because I've been like, what the heck am I doing?
I'm gonna talk about the color values for faces.
Okay.
So that'll make more sense then. This would just be any color in general. If you know, like if I have an image with some green in it, let's just take this one because I did something to it. And I start adjusting, and I know like the stone should be kind of gray, but as I adjust it, it's changing the green foliage. I might want to point here because I know that should be kind of gray, and I might want to point somewhere in this green so that I can look at the values here and make sure that my red and my blue channels don't go above the green, because then it's not going to be green anymore. My foliage should stay green. That number should always be higher. I can pay attention to it as I adjust the rest of it. It's going to adjust that green. I might have to do another, like a separate curves layer, and mask out just the green foliage so that that foliage is green, the building is gray, and do localized adjustments based off of that. That's essentially what I'm doing here. Oops, zoom out. So I can make that adjustment. Now I want to show you a trick that might help you as you're adjusting. When I'm adjusting a certain point, if I go back into my blue channel here, if my point, if that spot that I put on my curve, that point that I laid down, is a solid color, that's the one that's active. If it's an open square, like my highlight one up here, that one is inactive. I can click on it to make it active, and move that point, or I can click back on this one and move it that way, or this one. Now here's the reason I'm telling you this. If I click on it, the one that's active, I can use my up, down, left, right arrows on my keyboard to move that point tiny increments at a time, which you will probably like. I'm hoping you like using the arrows, because what you're going to find is that as I grab and I move my curve all over the place, it takes a bit to get used to, but then you'll see if I just drag it up, it's not working right. I need to drag it like up and to the right, and now it's a little bit more accurate. That I find I just go up and over until I get the color values I want using the arrows, but you have to make sure that that's the one that's active, otherwise you're moving something else. So it's good to pay attention to that. And that way too, once I have a point laid, I'm gonna show you this a little bit later, but what I find I do is I have that color sample point, and then I just quickly flip between my RGB channels, and I click a point, go to my green, click a point, go to my blue, click a point. Now I can freely move around just using my arrows and my quick keys flipping between the color channels until I get exactly what I want. And I'll show you that a little bit later. But it works really, really well when you lay those points and then you just use your arrows and you can flip back and forth between all the color channels really quick. All right, are you doing okay with that so far? Because it's not easy to understand and it's going to take a lot of play to fully understand. But if you know how to lay those points by using that little hand pointer, lay those points, and then you can either grab and move it up and down, or you can use your arrows. That's good.
If you put one in the wrong spot, how do you get rid of it?
Yeah.
You can delete it. You can go to, with the color sample tool, you can click to activate a certain point. It'll turn into a pointer tool, and then you should just be able, can I do it without deleting all of them? Oops. Nope, it deleted my setting. I want to do, what if I right click on it?
Yeah,
I can clear all of them, but I don't want to clear.
Mine just did one, and I clicked on it and I right clicked.
Oh, you did. Mine is not letting me.
It wasn't
moving
deleting
it.
it when I hit the delete key though.
Yeah, it deleted my setting. You can grab and move them though. So if you laid a point and it's in the wrong spot, you can grab and move it to a different spot. But mine, oh, there it goes. My mouse have not been clicking right. But yes, you should be able just to right click and delete. You can clear all at the top if you want to get rid of all of them. Otherwise, just right click. There it goes. Now it's working. Didn't work the first 2 times I clicked. The only thing it will do is that now what I have to do, if I delete, like I just deleted number 3, number 4 then becomes number 3. I just have to be aware that they're all going to shift if I have anything beyond that last one. Okay, if we know this much, this is going to take a little bit to sink in. Don't worry. The biggest part is that they're right across from each other. Now we can talk about skin tones. This is where it gets interesting. I'm going to talk about skin tones, but keep in mind, this is going to hold true beyond skin tones. I like giving the skin tone values and practice using skin tones because I think it'll be easier to understand, like, oh, when I'm adjusting a flower, I know that I have magenta in it, so I have to be aware of the RGB values and make sure that green is a lower number than everything else to be able to do the other stuff. So when we talk about color correcting things, we will often talk about it in terms of their CMYK values rather than the RGB. And again, it's an additive subtractive thing because we're working towards, most of the time, an end result is going to be print. So when we look at it, we're bringing in percentages and fractions, so I apologize for the math lesson, but when we talk about skin tones, every different variation of skin tone has a different combination of cyan, magenta, and yellow. So I have each one of these outlined up here for you. The general rule when we talk about skin tones from a Caucasian standpoint is that the magenta and yellow values, whatever those percentages are in Photoshop, let me bring up Photoshop here, whatever those values are up here percentage-wise, and again I'm looking at the right side because that's with my adjustment layers turned on, those magenta and yellow values are going to be pretty close to the same percentage. Whatever that percentage is, they're going to be fairly close. Those percentages, there's not a magic percentage, like you have to have it at 20% and 22%, because even within within different facial features, your forehead's going to appear darker than your nose because your nose sticks out a little bit more. It's going to be brighter because it's closer to the light. So those percentage values, there's not a magical number. It's just those percentages are going to be close together. So magenta and yellow will be close, but the yellow should be slightly higher than the magenta. And every person is going to be different. If you have someone that's paler, they are going to have oftentimes a little bit more yellow and cyan in there, less yellow and cyan in their skin versus someone with a darker skin tone. As your skin tones get darker, you add in a little bit more yellow and a little bit more cyan. But those magenta and yellow is going to be close. You just want the yellow a little bit higher. That's usually the first step. Get those two colors close together.
Which two?
The magenta and the yellow.
Okay.
Usually you try and get those two close together first. Then you look at the cyan values also. Cyan, and again, the darker the person's skin tone is, the more cyan is added into that, the more cyan values are going to show up. Your cyan is typically a quarter to a third, whatever the percentage of the magenta and yellow is. So this is saying, for example, if I have someone Caucasian skin, the magenta and yellow you'll see in this example is 60% and 62%. And that's just what these values read out here, over here. But I gotta move my mouse onto my image. Those magenta and yellow values, that percentage is going to be close. Yellow should be a little bit higher on skin tones, but then your cyan is going to be a third to a quarter of that percentage. So if you think of a third of magenta, a third of that is about 20%.
You're asking me to do math.
You're going to have to do some math. And you're going to have to do it in your head.
But if it's different on all different parts of the face?
It will be. We have to pick a certain point.
On one part, but then it's 20% on another.
On another part. It depends on how much light is in the image. So there are certain parts of the face that we'll read off of to do those because of that. But those parts that we do read off of, that's about what it's going to come to. So again, it's more of a general range. You're going to have to look at the image and see if it looks right. Your monitor calibration will make it possibly look like it's not right, but then when it prints, it might be just fine. But you will kind of gauge it off of what you're looking at and what you know that person's skin tone looks like, and kind of guesstimate that in between that quarter to third range for the cyan. So I'm going to run through all of these skin tones, but then we'll open up an image, and if someone doesn't have a image with a person in it just to do this exercise, I'll transfer a file so you can use it. When we talk about African American skin tones, it's going to be similar as far as magenta yellow. However, the cyan, because of the color tones in African American skin, it's a little bit darker too. And as skin tones get darker, more cyan is added in. So cyan is typically 1/3 of whatever the value of magenta yellow is, or more. It depends on how dark their skin tones are. I have the perfect image if I have it on this drive. Let's do this. Let me open it and see if I have it. Let me open it in Bridge because I don't feel like going through 1,000 photos. I think it's in, oh, I do still have it. Okay, hold on. Let's go back in time 10 years. But let's talk about color correcting the hardest image ever. Oh, it's a JPEG. That's okay. We're still going to use it. Okay, here's the trick.
Aww.
You have my pale skin, my sister's pale ginger skin, my cousin who went to a tanning booth before the wedding, and then my sister-in-law and my niece who have much darker skin tones. So every single one of these people have to be color corrected individually because our skin tones are so different. I'm pale, my cousin's not, but we're both Caucasian. My sister-in-law and my niece are African American. They're about the same skin tone, but if you get all of us in the group together, my husband is much lighter than the two of them. So we have to color correct him individually from his sister and his niece because he's much lighter. So his cyan value is going to be closer to that 1/3 percentage versus Tracy and Paige, which are going to be much darker. So they're going to have more cyan. They're going to be a little bit more than 1/3 when we color correct them because their skin tones are naturally darker than his. So it's an interesting challenge. So this is a good one to bring up and use as an example. Oops, not what I wanted. So typically 1/3 or more the cyan value, but magenta and yellow are going to maintain equal. Yellow might still be a little bit more. The last one is going to be Asian skin tones. Again, this is going to be very, very similar to Caucasian skin tones when we talk about percentages, except for the yellow is going to be a bit higher. It could be up to 10% higher depending on the skin tone of that person. But you do have to be careful because it is very easy to add in too much yellow. So you have to be careful. But it is going to be a bit more yellow than a Caucasian skin tone, but the other values are very much the same. It's just that Asian skin tones tend to have a bit more yellow in them, hence that value being a little bit higher. So that's gonna cover a lot of different skin tones, no matter who you're color correcting. You're going to get very close with those values. Of course, when you have someone who is like my friends, her kids are Hmong and Caucasian, and so those values, you kind of have to find that happy medium. And then you have, even my own children. My husband's African American, but I'm Caucasian. But each one of them is a different variation in skin tones. My youngest is paler than I am. So, there's the variation. So you have to find that happy medium there. When it comes to that, sometimes you do have to have a different color adjustment you have to have a different layer for every single one of those adjustments. So it can become tricky. But this is no different than if you are retouching a landscape, like the Alcatraz picture. You have the stone has to be one color. When I adjust the green to be as vibrant as I want, it's going to tweak and add some green in here that I don't want. So I'm going to have a different adjustment for every single one of these things. The blue is going to have to be different. The sky is going to have to be separate than everything. So everything operates independently, whether it's skin tones or other things. So I want to, maybe I will use this one as an example just to have an image. Whoa, why is this not doing what I'm telling it to do? And I'm not touching the mouse and it's still moving. Okay, let's start with Trisha because I don't want to look at myself. So when we color correct off of somebody's skin tones, first of all, I need to neutralize this because this is too yellow to begin with. So I'm going to find a dark area. See if that works. I don't have a light point. That's yellow. The dress is not white. But that's white. I need to find, I think the only thing that's close to white is the edging of the dress. We're gonna go with that. There we go. There, we took out some of the yellow and lightened it a little bit. Okay, now I can do these skin tones here. So I'm gonna start here. Now when we do skin tones, not 200%, we typically stay away from cheeks and noses when you're sampling the color values, because cheeks naturally have more magenta in them. So we don't want to use that as our source. What I usually try and use is somewhere in the mid-tone range on the forehead. You don't want to get too dark into the shadow depending on how the light is. And you don't want to get into a highlight because that's not going to be accurate either. So you try and find that middle range on a forehead. And then look at the color values too. So if I'm looking at this, let me use my color sample tool here. If I'm looking at this, I'm going to set 1 point on Trisha. I'm going to put one on Paige right away. Maybe let's do one on Lori while we're at it. Okay. So on Trisha's face right now, if I look at these values, now I'm also looking at the RGB values. That's the hard part. I want to see the CMYK values. I can change that on any one of them. Next to any point that you put, or even up here if you're not seeing what you want, I can click and hold down. There's a tiny little drop arrow by the little eyedropper icon. And I can choose to see the CMYK values instead. There is a setting for the panel where I can change that so it's like that all the time. So I can say it should always read out as CMYK rather than RGB. Otherwise I could just manually change them depending on what I'm doing here. I'm just going to change them because it's going to be easier here. So on my sister's forehead here, what I'm seeing for percentages is my magenta's at 56%, my yellow's at 55%, and my cyan's at 22%. So do you remember what the Caucasian skin tones were? Without going back to it. Magenta and yellow are pretty much the same. Yellow will be a little bit higher. So right now I have too much magenta is what it's telling me because it's higher than my yellow value. And then what about cyan?
Like 1/4?
1/4 to 1/3, yep. So just to make math easier, let's do 60%. A third of 60% is 20. So I need to be 20% roughly or below. That's just how I do my math. Hopefully that's easier for you. So roughly 20% or below is what my cyan value should be. So right now my cyan's a little bit too much. And it is especially too much because she's very pale. So I know that cyan value should probably be closer to 1/4 for Trisha versus Lori, and Lori's in the shadow a bit more here. She's my number 3 pinpoint here. So this value, first of all, my magenta is way high compared to my yellow, which doesn't look like a whole lot, but when you see the changes, you're going to be like, oh yeah, she's way too magenta. But also my cyan value is a little bit off because she should probably be a bit closer to that 20%, if not a little bit more, just because her skin tone's a little bit darker. So I'm going to start working with my curves now. I'm going to use that point. Now I'm going to have this curves layer just for my white and black, and I'm even going to label it that way. Black and white point so that I know. I'm going to have a separate adjustment, and in this case I'm going to have to do a separate adjustment for each person. Sometimes you can do it and it covers everyone in the picture. In this case it's really not going to work. So I'm going to have a new curves. This one's just for my sister. I'm going to pinpoint I'm going to use this little, honestly I don't even know the real name for it. It's just the modify curves tool. I just call it the little pointy hand. I'm going to use my little pointy hand and I'm going to mouse over to where I set that color sample to make my life a bit easier. I'm going to go into each color channel and I'm going to set the point for the red, the green, and the blue. This is where your quick keys are really going to help you because I don't want to move my mouse. I want to leave my mouse right there. So I'm going to use my quick keys. I'm going to go option 3 to go into the red channel. And it's saying for red, it's way up in the highlights. So I'm going to click there. Then I'm going to go into my green.
I'm so lost.
Nope. Okay. So you're gonna go into, so I have a new curves adjustment, do you have that?
Yeah.
Okay. And then you're gonna go into the, let's see, you've got that tool activated, you got your mouse there. Okay, so what you have it showing you, that's where it's gonna put the point. So
Okay.
simply just click your mouse, you know, right there, so that it puts the point there. Now go into the green channel, and you're gonna set a point for that. So you're really not moving your mouse, you're simply switching channels. So I do option 4 to get to green, and I click. I do option 5 to get to blue, and I click. Now I have that particular pixel that I'm gonna try and color correct off of in all 3 color channels is what I have it in. Now I can do a couple of things. I can, since I have my color sample tool right here, I don't have to keep my mouse here because it's number 1. I can just look at these values and then grab and drag this wherever I want. Or if I really want to make it easier, my mouse can go anywhere, but I know I'm looking off of number 1 color values. I can now use my up and down arrow keys because those 3 points are activated. So I can, okay, so now I'm looking at this, and where it's starting at, magenta's a little bit higher than yellow. So I need to adjust one of those 2, and the trick is that there really isn't a better one to adjust over the other. You're kind of just gonna have to play. So I'm sorry, I can't say you have to adjust the magenta for the yellow, but it isn't. You're gonna pick and choose. You're gonna play a little bit to see what looks good. All I know is one of these 2 color channels, I either have to take away magenta so that it's less than the yellow value, or I have to increase yellow so that it's more than the magenta value. Because either way, the end result, yellow has to be just a little bit more than magenta and not the other way around, which is what it is now. So I'm going to choose to take away some magenta, just to try. Now here's where I have to know that one slide I was showing you. Ooh, I didn't take anything. This one. I know that I have to adjust either the magenta or the yellow. Now magenta and yellow is not one of the channels I'm working in. So I have to know that if I'm taking away magenta, I have to go to the green channel and I have to move that sucker up because it's going to add green and take away magenta. So when I do that, I'm in the green channel right now. I have this, my spot is active. I'm just going to use my arrows because that's what I'm used to. And I'm just going to increase that a little bit, and I'm going to watch this number right here. So you can see I bumped it up. I used my up arrow a little bit, and I kind of chisel it over a little bit. I go up to the left, because it's moving my curve that way. So I moved it up. So now my yellow, you'll see it actually changed the yellow value too. This is why we can't just go into one color channel and expect it to change and leave everything else the same, because it adjusts all the colors when I'm working on it. So I'm going to be flipping back and forth between color channels a little bit until I get the right setting. So just this slight little adjustment, it's just ever so slightly. And this is why I'm using my arrows on my keyboard, because I find it to be a little bit easier than if I move my mouse. My mouse makes quicker drastic changes, where I want this to be so subtle that it's just the arrows on the keyboard that give me that capability. So now this adjustment, yellow is reading more than magenta. That's good. And it's only like 2%, so that's perfect, because it's just, they should be real close. Now I have to adjust the cyan on this image. So now I need to go into my red channel, because red is right across from cyan. In order to make that adjustment, I have to go into my red channel. And here's that point that I laid earlier. So I have to, my cyan should be 1/3 to 1/4 of my other 2. So do I have to add cyan or take away cyan? If these are my percentages currently, 22, 54, and 56. Should I be adding cyan or taking away? Taking away. So in order to take away cyan, I have to do what?
Go to red and move it down.
and I have to add red. I have to add red to take away cyan. So moving down, add cyan. Moving up takes away cyan, which is obviously too much. So again, this is why I'm going to use my arrows, because it's going to be somewhat subtle of a change, and I'm looking at my number 1 value here. So I'm going to just start moving it up, and just guesstimating those percentages. A third of roughly 60% is 20, so I know it has to be less than 20. But you can see what it did is, as I'm changing it, I'm adding red, which of course is making everything else look horrendous, but that's why we'll mask it to just the skin. As I'm doing that, my magenta and yellow values are now back to being the same. So I gotta go back to my blue channel, and I have to either increase the yellow or take away some of the magenta by adding some green to it until these values are a little bit closer. So now these monitors aren't calibrated, so it looks horrendously red, but it is a guess. It is a guessing game. I might still find that as I do that, it's too much red. Even looking at it, I know that even though these monitors aren't calibrated, even though they're not calibrated, I know that's going to be too much red. So I might just add some cyan back in. It'll probably be a good third, like 20% probably looks just fine. But now I have too much yellow again. Darn it. There we go. It's a little bit closer. So now those color tones, now this is again based on the way that we color correct in our culture, we have those warmer tones. If we were of like an Asian culture, we would be looking at those values differently, where the yellow value should be less than the magenta. Like the yellow and the cyan colors would probably be, I should say closer together because that'd be way off. But there's going to be more of a cyan percentage and more of a blue or less of a yellow percentage because of the cooler tones that we typically apply. But now for Trisha's skin, that's going to be a lot closer. So for her, that's a good adjustment. But when I look what that does to Paige, and when I look what that does to Lori, Lori's my number 4. She has way too much magenta in her skin tone with this adjustment. She still has, it's still really bad. And then the cyan value is now too low for her. It needs to be higher. So no, this curves is just for Trisha. And I will probably make this adjustment to just her skin tone. I could probably apply it to mine and be fine. So I'm actually going to mask this so that it's just her skin tone. So I'm going to fill this with black on my layer for Trisha. Maybe I should add my name to it so it'll be the same. On this layer mask, I'm going to fill it with black. Black's my background color. So I'm going to Command Delete because that's the background. It's going to hide everything for now, and then I'm going to use my brush, and I'm going to brush in that adjustment just on our skin tones at 100% and normal. It's not a huge adjustment, but it makes a difference. And it was freezing in there, so my hands are purple. So I probably need a purple adjustment. I need to add some yellow into my hands because they look very blue. There we go. Okay. So as far as skin tones are concerned, this isn't too bad. You can see it's a very subtle difference, but it's going to make a big difference once everyone else is adjusted because now it looks off. Everyone else is so yellow and magenta. So now I could move on to the next person. Actually, let me do Paige. So now I'm going to add a different curves adjustment, but now this one, when I look at it, this is now my second point. I'm going to look at these values differently because Paige should have more cyan than everyone else does, Paige and Tracy. So I'm now going to, with this adjustment, I'm going to go back into my RGB channels and do the same thing to this point that I put on Paige's forehead. So I'm going to go option 3 into my red, I'm going to click, option 4 into my green, click, option 5 into my blue, and click. Now I can look at these values and figure out what I need to do. So when we talk, I swallowed funny, ugh, it's like burning in my throat. So when I look at these values now Paige is this number 2 color sample, I have yellow is 71 and magenta is 62. Those should be a lot closer. There's way too much yellow in her skin tone right now. So that might be the first thing I adjust. I might go into that blue channel, because remember blue is across from yellow. So I might go into that blue channel to try and bring that number down closer to that 62%. And I'm in the channel right now, so I can either use my arrows or just kind of grab and drag this so that it's a bit closer. I'll start there. So I have, without losing her face in my picture, I've effectively taken out some of the yellow, but her face is just too blue because I also have to look at this. So cyan is at 20%, which is almost exactly a third, and African American skin needs to be at a third or higher. She is a bit darker in her skin tones, so I'm going to take away some of that red from her face and add in a little bit more cyan. So I'm going to go to my red channel here by doing my option 3, and it's active. So I'm going to, I gotta zoom out, I can't see her. Everything in the same window. So I'm gonna try and take this cyan value and I'm gonna increase it because I want that percentage to be a bit higher. So I'm gonna go down instead of up because I want to take away red and I want to add some cyan into her skin. But I'm also changing this, so I have to pay attention to my values here of my magenta and yellow. Actually not too bad, that's a bit better. She definitely does not have a lot of red in her skin tone to begin with. So it looks much better for Paige's skin. Of course it's affecting everybody, so I need to, like Trisha now looks this purpley blue, so I can't let it affect her skin. So now I have to mask that to just Paige, and Tracy's very close, so I'm going to mask her too. So I'm going to do a command delete because my black is the background, and then with my brush tool in white at 100% I'm going to, it doesn't help that this background has a lot of yellow in it, so everything's going to look a little off. I would have to fix this background. There's just too much yellow. So now I'm going to do Tracy, I'm going to do Paige, and I'm obviously not masking this real great. Now I'm left with Lori, who now looks orange compared to everybody else. She now looks really orange. So now I would have to do the same thing for her. So this is going to be Paige and Tracy. Now I'm going to do an adjustment, and this one's going to be for Lori, my overly tanned cousin. And I'm going to go into the color channel. I'm going to do red, click, option 4 green, click, option 5 yellow or blue to do yellow, click. And now I'm going to look at my number 3 color sample here, and this is the one I'm going to do. Way too much magenta. Let's go into that green color channel, and I'm going to go up to add green and take away that magenta. That looks 100% better even if I don't touch anything else. And then I can go, and my next one would be to go to my cyan. So I need to adjust that. It's actually not too bad. I don't know if I'd want to increase it too much. But I can go up to 20% because that would be a third. And I can go a little bit less if I need to. It's not too bad. But now the rest of us look sickly now that we've adjusted her. So, same thing, mask. Command delete to fill in my mask with black. Use my brush with white at 100. Whoops, wrong person. And brush Lori. Now we're looking a bit better here. My background is a bit off, especially when you compare it to Paige. So I might actually, let me try to, oops, wrong button. Okay, that's where it is. Deselect, and I want to disable. I want to bring down, I'm going to use the adjustment that I did on Paige and Tracy, and I'm going to make the background the same color. But I'm only going to brush this at 50%, I think, because I'm afraid it'll be too much otherwise. So we're just going to roughly brush that background, taking out some of the yellow and the magenta. too bad. That's so much better. Okay, so we started here and we ended here. So now every person has been color corrected. Now again, keep in mind these are not calibrated monitors, so it might look a little bit different and off. But if we're looking at the percentages, those values, and I just got out of my color sample, go back, bring them back. If we're looking at those percentages, they're all pretty close to where they need to be. So now Trisha, her yellow's just a little bit more. This is roughly about a third at 20%, maybe a little high, but it's too red otherwise. And then number 2 is going to be Paige and Tracy's skin tones. Yellow's a little bit higher than magenta. Cyan is a little bit more than a third. And then Lori is my number 3 one here, and her magenta is now higher again. How did that happen? Is it the background? First of all, label that. How did she get to be higher again? Grr. Let's go back into green. What the heck? Now it's, I didn't touch anything, and now it's lower again. I have no idea why it's doing that. That's weird. Okay, I didn't touch anything, I just made that layer active, and those numbers are fine. Okay, that's irritating. So 64 and 63, yellow's a little bit higher. Cyan is roughly about a third, maybe a little bit less in this case. It's just because of where the light falls. The light was closer to the left side of the image, so she falls darker. But compared to all the red and yellow that was in everyone's skin tone, we have a much more accurate image. So it's playing with those values and looking at the percentage of the CMYK. Now I don't always set the color sample point unless I have multiple people in the image. I often will just leave my mouse at the point I'm referencing and use my arrows to go up and down and not even set a color point. And it works just fine. As long as my mouse is in that general area of where I'm sampling from, then I'm okay. One thing to know is if we're talking skin tones, kids have more pink in their skin normally, so those magenta values might be equal. Sometimes a little bit higher, but you don't want it to be more than 1 or 2 points. But again, this holds true for anything. I mean, if I'm color correcting this flower here, I should not see my magenta value should not be really, really high. I mean, when I look at the flower and the color point, my yellow is, well, where I just was at 100%. And my magenta was at 43, which it's going to pick up some magenta, but it shouldn't be too horribly high. My cyan should be low because it's yellow. So it's a matter of knowing what colors it should be picking up. Now, if you get, here's something I should show you because it's happening. In my cyan, magenta, yellow, I can't move my mouse or it won't show. In the upper right corner here, I have exclamation marks. That means that part of that image is oversaturated. So the red is too saturated for it to actually pick up some of those color values. That's why it's showing up in exclamation marks. So if you have that, there's too much saturation. So I could probably tone down the saturation of these flowers here because they're kind of all across the board, it's a little oversaturated. So I could do a hue saturation and either just darken the luminance and bring down the saturation a little bit, and that might fix the whole thing. But that's what that means if you get an exclamation mark. So I know this is not easy to understand or necessarily do, but I would like for you guys to practice with your images and attempt to color correct, regardless of what type of image it is. I want you to practice using, I would like for you to use curves. You can use levels to do like white and black points, but really to do the color correction part of it, I would like for you to use curves. That's just the beginning of it, because we can get even more in detail when it comes to color correcting highlight and a shadow of the exact same color. Those might require different tone curves to adjust, but this is kind of the beginning of understanding our red and cyan is in the red channel to adjust those colors, and green and magenta and blue and yellow. So that's just the starting point of this. It goes beyond that, but trying to get a grasp of that is really what I want your goal to be for this. What I put in the folder for this week, I put a link to that skin book. This is the second edition. Like I said, why it's not for sale through Amazon or whatever, like it's out of print almost is what it seems like. But the first one is there. See, there's the first one. I don't understand. But the second one isn't. And there's different variations of it. I'm not quite sure why. It's the same book. It's not like it's printed at different times or anything. But it's there. It's a good reference. You can absolutely borrow my book for a week or so if you wanted to look through it. But it's a great reference. So that's there. The presentation that I have with those color values in, if you need to go back to it, that PDF is there for you guys to use. But what I want you to do for this assignment is I'm going to leave it as open as possible. So I want you to color correct 10 images. It doesn't matter if it has a person in it, if it's a landscape, whatever it may be, use any part of that. I would like at least, well, all the images are going to have to be submitted because you could do these adjustments in RAW if you want to. If you think about it, if I were to, I'm just going to open this. I'm just going to open this in Camera Raw filter to show you something real quick. If you have a raw image, you have the tone curve, and if you use the point tab and not the parametric, that point tab will allow you to do the exact same things. You have the red, the green, and the blue color channels to work with. So you can edit it that way. It is a little trickier because of the fact that we don't have, like, I have to actually find that point. Like, it, unlike in Photoshop, when I mouse over, I don't have the option of that modify curve tool, that little pointy hand, where when I mouse over, it's going to show me where that point is. I don't really have that option. I'm kind of guessing that's the only downfall. And let me check something, because I don't, oh no, I can still use my up and down arrow. So I can use my up and down arrow to flip back and forth, to modify this a little bit. So you do have the option of doing that there. If you want to try that, then what I would recommend is that you submit that file in a DNG format so I can see that. Then I want at least one, let me zoom this in a little bit here. I want at least one of these to be exactly what I was just showing you, like with the skin tone. It doesn't have to be with skin tone. But modifying the color channels, the red, the green, and the blue color channels individually, just like we just were, where there's a point on the blue and then you adjust either add or take away with each one of those individually. At least one. If you do it to all 10 images, perfect. I just need to see it in at least one of your images. I want at least one of your images, I want you to use the threshold where you set the white and the black point using the threshold. So you'll use the threshold, leave that layer there, but then obviously you'll turn it off when you're done setting those points. I want at least one to use that. Again, use more if you want. I want at least 2 examples to have that localized adjustment. So it's essentially what you're doing with all of them, only you're using the layer mask like I did here, where I had multiple people and they each had to have a different adjustment for the skin tones. So I masked out each person individually in their skin tones to do that adjustment. So I want at least 2 of your adjustments to have what we call the localized. So like the green foliage is one adjustment, the structure in the background is another adjustment, the sky could be a third one. I want at least 2 images to have that done to it, where you're masking out those adjustments, if that makes sense. Otherwise, it's wide open to do what you want. And again, you could do all of this to all 10. It doesn't really matter. It just needs to be present in at least one, or in the last case, 2 image adjustments. Does that make sense? Hopefully. Color correction is probably one of the hardest things to do. So you're not going to master it after this assignment, but the goal is just to practice with it, get familiar with the tools and how they're going to function. This is one of those assignments where I really want to give you a ton of feedback on, where I talked about how I want to do that in-person feedback. This is one of those where it's going to be necessary for me to do an in-person feedback to kind of explain what to do or how to make it better, but it's obviously going to be driven more by you. Do you want to make it better? Do you want it to go into portfolio? That kind of stuff. So I'll obviously make comments in the grade book where I can, but it's one of those where I have to kind of show you more than anything. But yeah, other than that, you're going to turn in either the PSD or the DNG file for these images, depending on what you do. But other than that, it's completely open. Just make sure when you submit it, we're getting to the point in the semester where we should be submitting everything correctly. When you're submitting your stuff, make sure that you're creating your folders. Most of you are creating the file names, like with your last name, first letter of your first name, but when you stick the folder on the server, you're doing first name, last name. So make sure your folders are correctly too. All the classes are doing this. So like in your ACR assignment, like this was great. You guys are doing great with this, but I'm noticing some of them where it's like last name, or it's first letter of your first name and then last name. Just make sure you continue that. I'm noticing it in all the classes where like the file names are fine, but the folders aren't, but the folders have to be the same too. So we're getting to the point where points get deducted if that simple little thing is not done. So don't forget.
So you want each of the file names also to have the
Those I don't worry about. It's more so like the folder.
folders. Okay.
Yeah, if you do it on the file names too, that's great. But it's more so the folder that it goes in more than anything. Does anyone have any questions on that assignment? It is really just play. Okay. So that is your goal for next week. Next week, my brain is fried. I don't even remember what we're doing next week, to be